Well, good evening. You're listening to the United We Strike radio marathon for July 2013, and our motto here is don't buy, don't comply, and ask why. If anybody out there kind of enjoyed that last little tune I played, you might want to swing over to YouTube and do a search for Lindsey Sterling, Lindsey Sterling, as in sterling silver. She's a hell of a violinist, nice-looking young woman, and she plays a hell of a fiddle. And that was her rendition of Grenade, a Bruno Mars tune, and she was backed up by Alex Boyer, was the singer on that one. Nice tune. In any case, we're coming close to a wrap on this month's marathon. You just heard a pre-recorded session from Vinnie Eastwood, and we're about to hear a recorded session from Siobhan Ciresi of, oh my goodness. All right, Siobhan. Yes, humanitytranscending.com. There's Siobhan's website. You'll have to excuse me. It's been a long day for me already. But in any case, please do stand by. This will be our last pre-recorded session of the evening, and I think this one runs about 20 minutes.
By Agnes Major, LLB, Lawrence Lee Baisley, 1937. He says, quote, "The modern banking system manufactures money out of nothing. And the process is perhaps the most astounding piece of sleight of hand that was ever invented." End quote. In a letter to Thomas Jefferson in 1787, John Adams wrote, quote, "All the perplexities, confusions, and distresses in America arise not from defects in their constitution or confederation, nor from want of honor or virtue, as much from downright ignorance of the nature of coin, credit, and circulation." End quote. Adams knew it was sheer ignorance, lack of adequate knowledge, and a blind acceptance that perpetuates this monetary fraud, keeping the people of the United States in a never-ending cycle of debt that we can never, ever come out of if we continue operating under this fractional reserve system of banking. Some of our own presidents, corrupt as they are, have acknowledged the true reality regarding the condition of the United States government. In Woodrow Wilson's book, The New Freedom, he states the truth: a great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is privately concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world. No longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men. End quote. 28th U.S. President, The New Freedom, 1913, Woodrow Wilson. In a letter to Colonel Edward Mandell House, President Franklin D. Roosevelt says, quote, "The real truth of the matter is, as you and I know, that a financial element in the large centers has owned the government of the U.S. since the days of Andrew Jackson." End quote. Insiders knew then, and they know now, who and what really runs this country. Putting it in perspective, the United States Congressman Larry P. McDonald stated in 1976 that, quote, "The drive of the Rockefellers and their allies is to create a one-world government combining supercapitalism and communism under the same tent, all under their control. There is such a plot, international in scope, generations old in planning, and incredibly evil in intent." End quote. In 1980, he introduced House Bill 773, calling for a thorough congressional investigation of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission, and he was also considering running for the United States presidency. He was invited to attend a celebration of the 30th anniversary of the United States-South Korea Mutual Defense Treaty, but tragically on the way there, his plane got shot down after entering Soviet airspace. McDonald wouldn't live to fulfill his presidential aspirations, nor his investigations of the CFR or Trilateral Commission. Education. Quote, "You think the purpose of education is reading, writing, and arithmetic? The purpose of education is to change the thoughts, actions, and feelings of students. You have to get a hold of the minds of the young. You break the person's values. You break their individuality. You bring them to consensus with the group. They become a member of the collective. It's Soviet education, basically. Might as well just say it. It's Soviet education," end quote. Charlotte Thompson Isserbit, Senior Policy Advisor, U.S. Department of Education, Reagan Administration, interviewed in One Nation Under Siege, 2006. Our brains have been filled with information derived from private or government-financed institutions of education. To read and reflect on what insiders have revealed about the purpose of our education system is chilling. I have personally faced some heavy emotions during my study of the material in this book. Being confronted with this information can be frightening and in certain moments heartbreaking. But this is the current reality. We cannot deny what is, and only when we become aware of these realities can we will to change them and be effective. Living in ignorance is why we are so far along in becoming the dreadful society we've only read about in history books. By relying on government and ultra-wealthy financiers to educate us, we have turned a most marvelous creation over to the so-called authorities, our brains. What's important now is that the truth is being uncovered one step at a time, and the truth of the matter is primary for really understanding just about anything. In the 1930s, the proposal of using our schools as conduits for New World Order propaganda began to surface and were heavily promoted. H.G. Wells, a former Fabian socialist who authored several prominent literary works, which are commonly required reading in schools across the United States, published The Open Conspiracy, Blueprints for a World Revolution in 1928. In it, he says, quote, "The political world of the open conspiracy must weaken, efface, incorporate, and supersede existing governments. The open conspiracy is the natural inheritor of socialist and communist enthusiasms. It may be in control of Moscow before it is in control of New York. The character of the open conspiracy will now be plainly displayed. It will be a world religion," end quote. 4 years later, head of the Communist Party USA, William Z. Foster, publishes Toward Soviet America, in which he indicates that a National Department of Education will be one of the means used to develop a new socialist society in the United States. D.L. Cuddy, Ph.D., History of the New World Order. More influential insiders would affirm this strategy. In 1946, former editor of the National Education Association Journal, Joy Elmer Morgan, in the Teacher and World Government, writes, quote, "In the struggle to establish an adequate world government, the teacher can do much to prepare the hearts and minds of children for global understanding and cooperation. At the very heart of all the agencies which will assure the coming of world government must stand the school, the teacher, and the organized professions," end quote. 1 year later, John Dewey, educational reformer and organizer for the American Education Fellowship, called for the, quote, "establishment of a genuine world order, an order in which national sovereignty is subordinate to world authority," end quote. The roles of teachers would be to educate students in the various proposals that had been made for the strengthening of the United Nations and the establishment of a world citizenship and world government. NEA Associate Secretary William Carr, NEA Journal, 1947. In a speech given by Aldous Huxley, author of A Brave New World, at UC Berkeley on March 20th, 1962, we really get a sense of just how disturbing this is. Huxley states, quote, Here, I'd like to briefly compare the parable of Brave New World with George Orwell's book 1984. The scientific dictatorships in the future will be nearer to the Brave New World pattern, because the Brave New World pattern is probably more efficient than the other. If you can get people to consent to the state of affairs in which they are living, the state of servitude, the state of being, the nature of the ultimate revolution of which we are now faced is precisely this, that we are in the process of developing a whole series of techniques which will enable the controlling oligarchy, who have always existed and presumably will always exist, to get people actually to love their servitude, where people can be made to enjoy a state of affairs which by any decent standards they ought not to enjoy. For example, the pharmacological methods. These methods are more refined than the old methods of terror because they combine methods of terror with methods of acceptance. The result would be, you can imagine, a euphoric which would make people thoroughly happy, even in the most abominable circumstances. I mean, these things are possible. End quote. Coincidentally or not, by 2007, more than 20% of the United States population was on some type of prescription antidepressant. Endgame 2001. The Brave New World pattern Huxley spoke of is surfacing today under Orwellian titles such as, quote, the New Freedom Commission. This is trickery for the mind. Dr. Rima Labau, MD, psychiatrist, gives us the deplorable details of this deception. The New Freedom Commission, established by George W. Bush in 2002, she says, is, quote, a federal program to mandate the bogus screening and compulsory medicating of children from infancy through 18 years of age in this country. Through the use of completely inappropriate screening techniques, any child who deviates from the prescribed feeling and thought pattern that is allowed to them will be compulsorily medicated even over the objection of their parents with dangerous, unproven, and untested psychiatric medications to control their thoughts, their behaviors, and to impede their emotional development. This is a federally mandated program. She goes on, as a psychiatrist, I remember very well the condemnation by the American Psychiatric Association of Soviet psychiatrists and the Soviet Union for their use of psychiatric techniques and psychiatric medications to control political dissidents. Sadly, shockingly, we in the U.S. have become those same oppressors. We now have a policy as exemplified by the FBI brochure from the Phoenix office on counterterrorism, which says people who are defenders of the U.S. Constitution against federal government and the UN and make numerous references to the U.S. Constitution should be monitored as potentially murderous and fanatical terrorists, and by extension should be considered mentally unstable. Under the New Freedom Commission, mentally unstable people must be medicated on a compulsory basis with lethal and untested but very profitable psychiatric medications. End quote. Dr. Rima Labau, Natural Solutions Foundation, and she also appeared in One Nation Under Siege. Adapted from Joyce Riley, One Nation Under Siege. She says, children in American schools are now signing an assent form, not a consent form, but a passive consent form saying that they will be involved in programs such as Teen Screen. Incentives like pizza parties and movie rental coupons are offered to coax students into joining without the consent or knowledge of their parents. Teen Screen asks children questions such as, have you ever been depressed? Are you afraid to speak in a group? Do you feel like your parents are abusing you? This questionnaire then goes on to be analyzed, and a diagnosis is actually made from the students' answers. Parents who have found out about this are now suing. They are now very upset, going to the school systems and saying, how dare you do this to my child without my knowledge? Charlotte Thompson Isserbit says, "You've got to veer them away from the idea of patriotism towards their country, sovereignty of the nation, belief in absolutes, right and wrong. You cannot expect to have a smoothly running world socialist system if you have people out there who are going to object to what you're trying to do. So you have to brainwash." This molding of the masses goes very deep. It is a stark, unnerving reality. I had wonderful teachers in my life and still do. They were and are good people. I do not assume they would willingly, purposely lead me astray. The indoctrination taking place is constructed at very high levels of the power structure and is filtered down in subtle ways. For example, textbooks present half stories, half truths, leaving out crucial points that may paint the established order in a negative light. Our schools teach us how to memorize information and simply recall it on a test, rarely touching on the deeper meaning in our history. Children in America are briefly taught about the Constitution, mostly dates of events, the names of those persons associated, and timelines. But besides this, can barely display any true understanding of history, or the present for that matter. This kind of talk about molding our children into complacency, into accepting a brave new hell on earth, is most likely not detected by the average teacher. However, once the teacher becomes aware that they are not necessarily teaching what's true, but in actuality indoctrinating the minds of the young into the prescribed creeds, the conscience of the individual is presented with a choice. Similar for the average news anchor on the local news stations. Some may not have the slightest idea about the corruption that permeates their work environment. But if and when they discover some hard truth about their unbeknownst role in perpetuating the mental and emotional enslavement of their society, the choice arises to close their eyes and deny or forget about it, and figure out how they can make a difference within the structure of the career they have, or embark on another path within their comfort zone and capabilities and take a stand for freedom of information and access to true knowledge. Evidently, our public schools prepared us to be hamsters on the wheel. Another worker, good in this profession or that profession, as long as we are competent enough to work and produce for the machine, for we are their human resource after all. We have been trained collectively to be highly efficient workers, dependent on the systems created for us, not autonomous free thinkers. The powers that be work around the clock to keep incredibly important information hidden from us. But it looks like they have a big problem on their hands. The world is waking up, and there is nothing they can do to stop this wave of enlightenment from reaching every mind, heart, and soul on this planet who has even the slightest desire to know the truth. The Federal Reserve. Quote, "Our geese are but geese, though we may think 'em swans, and truth will be truth, though it sometimes prove mortifying and distasteful." End quote. Benjamin Franklin. A Dissertation on Liberty and Necessity, Pleasure and Pain, 1725. In another play on words, our central bank, which calls itself the Federal Reserve, is not a federal government agency and does not draw on reserves. This has been understood since its inception in 1913, but the majority of Americans have no awareness of its private nature or its lending practices. A 1982 court case revealed that, quote, "The regional Federal Reserve banks are not government agencies, but are independent, privately owned, locally controlled corporations," end quote, Lewis versus the United States. Most opponents of the Fed are quick to point this out, but usually dismiss the government's role in this institution. The best way to go about understanding the Fed is to think of it as a hybrid or partnership between private banking corporations and the federal government. Adapted from a 1988 interview with Republican Congressman Ron Paul on Alternative Views. He explains that the Federal Reserve is not entirely private, that it's actually worse than just being private because it gets its authorization from the United States government. From his own observations as a congressman and historical knowledge, he and many others have discovered that the Fed is a very secretive, private, government-ordained corporation that has the power to counterfeit money. Suspiciously, Congressman Paul, along with the rest of Congress, as stated earlier, cannot participate in Federal Reserve meetings, nor audit the Fed's books. The Fed even has meetings where the Secretary of the Treasury does not attend. The Fed defends its uncooperativeness by maintaining that the financial statements of its reserve banks and the Board of Governors are audited annually by an independent outside auditor. However, Representative Paul points out that present audit process exempts the Fed's most crucial activities. Wikipedia, Audit the Fed 2009. What a surprise when it comes to the critical issues the public, as well as our representatives, are kept completely in the dark. In February of 2009, H.R. 1207, the bill to audit the Fed, was introduced by Ron Paul. H.R. 1207 currently has 308 co-sponsors, including all House Republicans, as well as over 100 Democrats and massive public support. This bill would allow the American people to take a magnifying glass to this institution and for the first time review its activities. But as we know, the powers that be are obsessed with secrecy. On October 30th, 2009, Bloomberg.com reported that H.R. 1207, bill to audit the Fed, has been gutted while moving toward a possible vote in the Democratic-controlled House. The bill has been stripped of provisions that would...
And you've been listening to a pre-recorded session from Siobhan Ciresi of HumanityTranscending.com. That concludes the planned presentations for this month's United We Strike Radio Marathon. Remember, don't buy, don't comply, and ask why.